All right, we're going to get started. So, thank you everyone for joining us for our online December meetup. What evils lurk over the horizon? So, I'm very honored to have Dr. Forno from UMBC talking to us. I met Dr. Forno a couple months ago, actually, when we were starting to plan the DAX conference. We were talking to him about potentially speaking, and over the months, we finally were able to make it work. And I think it's going to be a really interesting talk. It might be a little different than some of the talks we usually have. It's going to be heavily focused on the cybersecurity and the threats that we're going to be facing. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Forno in 1 second. I just want to go through our normal introductory slides, thank our sponsors, and do a couple upcoming events. So Silver Edge is one of our sponsors. They're a government contractor. They've been supporting us for many years under the Varen name. Now they're called Silver Edge. If you're interested in learning a little more about what they do, feel free to reach out. And then Clear Edge is another defense contractor that's been supporting us over the years. They also have been helping us with the conference. If you're interested in learning more, please reach out. Arius is my company. I am more than willing to talk to anybody who wants to learn more about what we do. Just reach out. I'm very easy to get a hold of. And then ScuttleGov is a little different. They're a company that focuses actually on staffing and recruiting and helping folks really find opportunities. So they're not a defense contractor directly, but they have good ties. So if you're looking for a career change, I would suggest reaching out. I know the owner that created it, and they're doing some really interesting things, and it's a different take on how you do career development. And Khaki is our final partner, and they're a very large defense contractor, and they've been recently supporting us. So if you're interested in working with them, please reach out. As you might saw in my most recent letter to everyone, we are going to kind of be a little more sparse on the event. So we're going to take a little break until February, and then we're working on an event featuring data journalism. So that'll be pretty soon. And then we still are doing the newsletter right now. So if you're interested, please sign up. And then I am still focusing on DAX. So this will be our next conference in June. We're starting to try to get together the speakers and sponsors and everything that's going to go on. So if you're interested in that, please reach out. And with that, I want to hand it over to Dr. Forno. So for this one, if you guys have any questions, I'll be monitoring the chat on YouTube and Zoom, and Dr. Forno said he'd be monitoring it. So just type your questions. If they get too complex, maybe we'll just have you speak, but go ahead and just type your question. And I'm going to let Dr. Forno take it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you can take over, Dr. Forno. Okay, all you.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well tonight. I see a couple of familiar names on here, colleagues, former students, which is both good and encouraging, so welcome. And Jason's right, this is going to be a little bit of a different talk, but I'm certainly going to touch on the areas of interest for this group, data and analytics as well. A little bit about me, if you didn't see the bio, I come from industry. I've been at UMBC for 13 years. Time flies when you're having fun. I am the director of our graduate program in cybersecurity. I'm also the assistant director of the UMBC Center for Cybersecurity, and I wear many other hats on campus as well. Before UMBC, I was consulting. Before consulting, I was in industry, the military, the government. I've been a hands-on keyboard geek as a network engineer, systems admin, sysop, all the way up to being chief security officer at the company that for several years ran the internet's DNS system. So we really were the center of the internet. So I've kind of gone through the entire litany of cybersecurity, corporate, if you will. And then I was doing academia was going to be my next career. So here I am. So first off, how might we view cybersecurity, cyberspace, all things cyber? Well, to most people, I think cyber tends to immediately imply computers. It's something geeky. So let's start with that. What's on computers? Information. And information is processed hither and yon, it's analyzed, and all this other great stuff. So the security and the integrity of this information is very important. After all, everybody on this meeting has heard the saying, the computer must always be right. How many times have you gone to the store and the cash register rang up something incorrectly, and there was a 20-minute delay while the manager had to look for the price because, it does not cost $10 for a stick of gum, but somebody fat fingered the price in the system and it rang up something incorrectly. Okay. If the information on computers is now trusted, it's trusted as reality and truth. And in some talks, I've kind of spun that out into a whole metaphysical, existential thing about how computers are shaping our reality. It's my matrix talk, if you will. But the bottom line is, we're at a point now where people have been conditioned to believe that if it's on the web, if it's on TV, if it's on the computer, if it's on social media, it must be true. So in response to this concern about the security and integrity of information, back in the 70s and 80s, when computers were still very much in their infancy and the size of large warehouses, the industry developed the idea of what we call the CIA triad. The CIA, in this case, stands for the confidentiality of information, the integrity of information, and the availability of information. And cybersecurity folks over the years have used that triad sort of as our guide star to govern and guide us in taking steps to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of information and information systems. That was great. And, it got us off the ground. And, here we are, 30, 40 years later, and computers are everywhere. But along the way, since the 70s, to deal with a lot of security problems, we threw technology at it. These security problems dealt with computers, and computers are technology. So let's just get the engineers in a room and develop some new product or service or software and use that and throw that at the problem, because that'll fix it, right? And admittedly, I was part of that crowd. I wanted technical solutions, and I wanted ways that we could have computers defend themselves and things like that. But at the same time, I also, took a step back and watched. And the reason why I say I took a step back and watched is, by way of background, I'm not a classically trained computer scientist. In fact, I have never had a computer science course in my life. My background is in national security policy in the humanities, in the digital humanities. My entire career has been in cyber and IT. I'm a self-taught geek in many ways. And that, I think, kind of gives me a unique perspective on looking at technology and cybersecurity, both as a geek, but also as somebody looking at the bigger picture of how this technology fits into the broader world around us. So that's why I say I stood back, but I also watched while I was helping out. So moving forward through time, since the dot-com days, when the world really realized at the turn of the century what internet and internet-related technologies could do, there's been a convergence. Think about it. We don't log in anymore. We're always logged in. The line between the cyber world and the real world, the virtual and the real, has really converged into the modern world. And the modern world is very dependent on cyber being pervasive and everywhere. And the latest example of this evolution is I cringe to even say it, but the idea of the metaverse concept, where they're looking to create a virtual world inside cyberspace. Well, my own take on that is, it was tried in the 90s, it was called Second Life. It's still around. Why are we reinventing the wheel? But that's why I'm not a Facebook stockholder. So we've converged, the virtual and the physical. And because of that, as I say, coming from the humanities, I kind of see cyber and cyberspace a bit differently. And I'm reminded of a saying by Leonardo da Vinci, the great artist, engineer, philosopher. And he would tell people, study the science of art, study the art of science, develop your sense, especially learn how to see, realize that everything connects to everything else. And I would say that Lenin also said that, similar words as well. But the idea is, take a step back and look at the broad view of the relationships, not just the platforms and the technologies, but the relationships they create, the people that are involved, the human factors, and how they interact with everything in what we now call our modern life. And that got me thinking a few years later. So now we're talking about maybe 2006, 2008 timeframe as I was working on a PhD. And the idea of how do we really define or explain cyberspace these days? I think we need to change that. We're no longer in this Gibson-esque mode of logging on and zooming through wireframe diagrams like you saw in Hackers or the original Tron movie, where it was this representation of of the real world on the computer. Rather, I look at cyberspace as having three dimensions. There's the physical dimension. Think of it as the network cables, the satellite providers, the actual hardware, the things we can touch. There's the informational aspect. What's on these systems, the information that's being exchanged, that's being analyzed, that's being crunched at various levels of computing power. And then thirdly, the cognitive dimension of cyberspace. And by this, I refer to the end user and users generally. I'll talk about these in greater detail in a minute. But cyber these days generally is pervasive as anything. It's not an engineering problem. It's not a geek problem. And we see this convergence happening even now when you look at the how many cybersecurity professionals, including me, have been involved with looking at cyber capabilities and internet security and technologies with influence and disinformation and misinformation and deep fakes and things related to election integrity and political campaigning and messaging, okay? It's hard to imagine 10, 15 years ago, a cybersecurity person, a perennial geek, suddenly working on things like political messaging and disinformation, but it's happening. Again, another example of this convergence. But as far as cybersecurity goes, at a big picture level, for decades, when you think back to that CIA triad that I mentioned earlier, we've always tended to focus on the C, keeping things secret. We tended to outsource the A, the availability. That's not a security concern, that's a network operations concern. That's a facilities concern. It wasn't a cybersecurity interest. And the integrity of information, the I, we marginalized it. We rarely spoke about it. But when you look back, especially these days, at things like the integrity of information in databases, what you see online is social media, disinformation, fake news, all that kind of stuff, that relates to the integrity of information. And folks, cybersecurity folks, we've been dealing with this stuff, hopefully in some ways, for many, many years. So that's why, again, as I say, that there's a convergence going on, and it's exciting to be part of it. So that's kind of a high-level view of how I've come to appreciate and view cybersecurity of cyberspace. What does this bode for the future? As the subject of tonight's talk, what evil lurks over the horizon? And I've put together a list of about 7 or 8 things that I think really are where we need to be focused and be concerned about as technologists and certainly as cybersecurity practitioners. First and foremost, I think the idea of developing and fostering operational resiliency in the modern world. What do I mean by that? Well, think of your cloud computing platforms, okay? You connect into your cloud service. Where is that server located? Where are your Google Docs located? They're in the cloud. Can you see the cloud? Do you know which country that cloud is in? Okay, how do you connect to the cloud? Very, very interesting. Very, very hard. When you look at the cloud and ransomware is another great example. Entire cities are shut down because ransomware paralyzes a city's infrastructure. Baltimore is a great example. A few years ago, the city was paralyzed for weeks because of a ransomware attack, coupled with poor IT processes that made it even more difficult. We've got a world where all of our critical infrastructure is smart and it's interconnected. Since 1997, we've identified critical infrastructures, whether it's oil and power distribution, water distribution, the banking and financial sector, all of these sectors that drive modern society are networked, okay? Have we taken enough precautions to make sure they can stay up and functional in the event of a crisis or a cyber attack or a natural disaster? In some cases, yes, some cases, no. So that's why I say at times, we may not be thinking through on the availability aspect. And this ties back to the idea of resiliency, right? If our network link goes down, can we access our cloud-based applications and services? Maybe yes, maybe no. Have we planned for it? Resiliency is so important to consider these days, not just the capabilities and the convenience of the technology, but what happens when things go wrong. I'm reminded of a great term that a trader at New York told me years ago, and he said that amateur traders see a trade, a stock market trade or a futures trade, and they look at how much they can make, and they tend to burn out very quickly and go bankrupt. But the folks that last around and make a career out of trading focus not on the gains, but on the risks. What's their risk exposure? So in terms of resiliency, we should be thinking about what is our risk exposure to a wide range of risks, be it natural or intentional. And this ties into a large concern I've had for the past 20 or so years about how much positive control we actually have over our computing and data. Okay? We don't necessarily have direct access to our cloud, to our data. Okay? We used to have our own data centers where we hosted everything in-house, but that became too costly, so we outsourced it. Okay? We are now dependent on cloud providers and remote providers for our computing capabilities. What kind of risk does that do, and what does that mean for our resiliency? And again, the more pervasive cyber capabilities get around the world, the more questions about resiliency and staying functional are going to come into play. Along those lines, we're seeing a huge invasion of IoT devices, devices that you might bring in from home, your personal phones in the workplace, the smart house, whether it's a smart refrigerator, a smart toaster, your Alexa device, your Echo, smart cars. I mean, cars these days are no longer cars. They're rolling computers, and in many cases, rolling black boxes. All of these technologies, again, are tied into a cloud. Okay, how far are we willing to rely on these technologies, knowing that the link between them and the cloud is, or may very well be, not as stable or secure as we think? Pretty much a concern for a lot of folks. A good example of the problems with the cloud deal with supply chain. Think of the security of the digital supply chain, from the research lab to product development, design, rolling it out, and fabricating stuff. A good example of this is the SolarWinds incident a couple of years ago. How do we trust this? Can we trust the security of our supply chains? And if we grant a third-party company, a Microsoft, an Oracle, a specific product vendor, to have root-level access to our infrastructure, to our data, do we trust them? What kind of due diligence did we do to ensure that that connection is trustworthy? And if it gets co-opted, as the case of SolarWinds, and we get attacked, well, that's a problem. Again, tying it back to the idea of resiliency. Here in 2022, we still do not often build security in from the start. Products are brought out to market very quickly on the hardware and software side or the internet services side because they want to be first to market. They may not have put security thinking into it from the beginning, but try to tackle that along the way. And that's a recipe for disaster. Here we are in 2022. The internet's been around in its current existence for 30 years. Along the way, we've had a lot of people providing recommendations and best practices and consulting services to say what needs to be done to develop secure and trustworthy systems. And yet we still see problems within these systems because a lot of companies will cut corners because they want to be the first ones to market. And if you can be the first one to market, that's great for the business and for the press and maybe your stock price, and then we'll deal with any problems later on. Huge concern. How we approach the supply chain, the entire supply chain of our technical infrastructure, I think is a concern that is not going to go away anytime soon, particularly when you look at countries like China, who up until recently were developing and selling us the very chips powering a good part of the Western world's infrastructure. It's a very disconcerting thought. Where I think we're going to see the largest concern, the largest threat over the horizon, we're seeing it now already. The advances in AI and machine learning tools and techniques for both attack and defense. I think we're only in the very early stages of what these capabilities can do. 20 years ago, a firewall was bleeding edge if it could detect an attack and then remotely configure itself to block a port. That was an intelligent firewall back then. We are light years beyond that now, thanks to computing power and deep learning that's able to then look at these attacks and this network traffic and do some much more deeper logic to figure out what's going on and take appropriate countermeasures. From a defender's perspective, that's great. But at the same time, security works both ways. There are defenders that are relying on this technology to improve their networks and their defenses. But the bad guys, whether they're a criminal or a nation state, use these capabilities to conduct more sinister types of network attack using these very same computing capabilities. A great example of this is look at how many people are online, LinkedIn, social media. It is so easy now to scrape LinkedIn profiles, scrape social media accounts, and gather a lot of information about somebody, and then create very tempting, very, very convincing phishing emails sent to a particular person or target to get them to click a link, let's say, or open a file, okay? Big data makes that very easy. Analytical capabilities these days make it very easy to craft these messages and collect information from a wide variety of public sources, okay, practically in real time. It's not going away anytime soon. It's getting more and more powerful. The defenders are thrilled at some of the capabilities of quantum computing for things like encryption, which is great. But again, these same technologies that are helping the good guys are also going to be helping the bad guys. So this debate, this conflict will continue and continue. But a lot of these problems overall that we see in the cybersecurity world, I think, really come back to really two things. And I would simply call them human factors and the vulnerability of people. I've said for years that the human brain is the most complicated computer in the world and is the most vulnerable one to attack. I've also, if you think about it, there were really three elements of a system, of a computing system: the hardware and the software, and then the wetware. The hardware and software we're used to dealing with. The wetware, the human brain, is a much more complicated problem. And I really think it's the reason why a lot of the problems that we in the cybersecurity community thought we had addressed keep coming back over and over again. Okay. So how about we look at ideas to train the brain? I'm not talking about games, but if we make mistakes, if a company or a government agency makes mistakes with how they run their networks or secure or don't secure their networks, why don't we hold them accountable in a meaningful way? And we show people that, yes, there are consequences for bad behavior or poor behavior. It happened when we were children. We would break a rule at home and our parents would punish us. There was a cause and there was a consequence. Let's think about how we can do that to help train people's brains and collectively that, yeah, we know what needs to be done to protect our information resources. Let's do it. But coupled with the idea of the human factors of kind of getting a grip on the vulnerabilities of the users at all levels, whether they're product developers, CIOs, security staff, and the end users, we've got another huge problem in this country and in this world that has yet to be reconciled, and that is the shortage of skilled labor and qualified cybersecurity and IT practitioners in this country, and indeed the Western world. And that leads to the question of how do we develop the next generation of effective cybersecurity and information practitioners? We all know about education, degree programs, and training certifications, and letters after your name and certifications and things like that. That's wonderful. But think about what I said earlier at the start. The cyber problem is not just a technical problem. Okay, this requires people who are not just fluent in geek, but also those who are not geeks, but have a critical eye and a critical mind. So you don't need to be a geek to be involved in cybersecurity. So we have to foster a broader view of the world when we're educating our future workforce, not just focusing on the technical skills, the specific skills. Give people the ability to be flexible and broad. in their analysis of things, and then they can specialize if they need to. But we need to have a much more broader view of the world than just the bits and the bytes. One option that's floated around continuously, in fact, I was talking to somebody online earlier today about this, creating standards, certification standards, accreditation standards of systems and information to make sure that we are in compliance with best practices. And we've been doing compliance activities for 20, 30 years easily. In fact, the federal government loves this stuff. And it's helpful to a point. But in my experience, a lot of times organizations view these compliance assessments as check the box. Are you running antivirus software? Yes or no? Check the box, move on. Do you have firewalls? Yes, check the box and move on. That's nice, but it doesn't really answer the question, are these tools being effective? Are they deployed effectively? Are they updated? Are they being managed effectively? So I would be very leery of pushing back or embracing what I call paper-based security as a solution. It's helpful, but it's not the total picture. So what I try to do in the first part of this talk here was just go over a couple of ideas about how I view cyberspace and cybersecurity, and then talk about the some of the big picture meta threats, meta vulnerabilities, meta concerns I see, some of which may be not as critical down the road, but certainly are ones that do concern me and others looking ahead. However, having said all that and thinking about things like resiliency, operational resiliency, ransomware attacks, things like that, I think a glaring weakness that's looming over the horizon, certainly on our front porch and definitely in our backyards, is the cybersecurity preparedness of America's own local governments and cities and counties and villages. We talk a lot about oil pipelines, sort of the big picture in the country, but there's not a lot of emphasis placed on really America's soft underbelly. And I think this is really where cybersecurity, the rubber meets the road to pretty much every citizen and resident in this country. We all live somewhere, and each one of these somewheres has a government, and the government's role is to provide for the safety and security of the people in that somewhere, wherever it is. So a few years ago, some UMBC colleagues started a project, and I was honored to be part of it in the latter stages. They did 2 surveys of America's 90,000 local governments, whether they were large cities or small villages or counties, 90,000 local government entities around the country. And this was done with the International City and County Management Association. They sort of, did the labor force. But we developed the questions and then they sent it out. Perhaps the biggest takeaway from this, and this still keeps me up at night 2 years after the report came out, is that 1/3 of America's local governments could not tell you if they're under a cyber attack. Over 1/3 of our country could not tell you it was under a cyber attack. That was very scary. They are, when we dove into the data last year, we realized that, local governments of all sizes, some are better equipped. The city of Baltimore, the city of Atlanta certainly is more well equipped than your local city of 50 people. But they share many, if not all, of the same problems that corporate America does and the government does, right? They're ill-equipped. They're under-resourced. Politics plays a huge role in how much money and resources can be provided for hiring cybersecurity staff to build the technologies, let alone monitor the technologies. It's the usual stuff. Cybersecurity has always been a problem at the corporate level and the government level, but this really revealed, a gaping hole in the chest of America's soft underbelly with our local governments. Local governments touch every aspect of our society. And think about the resources that local governments provide. When the Baltimore city government went down because of a ransomware attack, citizens couldn't pay bills, they couldn't pay traffic tickets, businesses couldn't obtain licenses, do real estate transactions. City employees could not communicate with citizens on matters of city duty. They were paralyzed. If that's not the most intimate example of cybersecurity affecting us at a grassroots level, I don't know what is. And we don't see a lot of people talking about that. And that to me is very disturbing. Maybe it's because local government is not glamorous or sexy, like, hacking at the national level and going after Russian hackers in Ukraine and things like that. But it is certainly a pressing concern that we are seeing more and more interest by foreign adversaries targeting local governments. And again, hospitals, school districts, things that affect us in our daily lives on a very personal, if not street level basis. We looked into this for a book that came out earlier this year from Wiley. That was the first study of this local government cybersecurity problem, and offering recommendations on what to do. And to be honest, the recommendations that we offer local governments are the same recommendations that we would offer the military, the government, or large companies. Okay, we know what needs to be done, but we're not doing it. So where does that bring us in this talk to the future? As I said at the start, cyber touches everything these days. I pick some aspect of your life, and cyber is involved. Cyber capabilities are involved either directly or certainly indirectly. The window of exposure, unfortunately, will always favor the bad guys. And by window of exposure, think of a sine wave. I presume many of you are engineers and mathematicians, folks on this call. Think of a sine wave, okay? As a situation, as a new threat or new vulnerability is detected, the good guys don't often find out about it first. It's usually the bad guys. The good guys don't know about it until the vulnerability is being exploited actively. Then the good guys realize, and then they work to develop a fix or a countermeasure. And then that problem goes away. And you've got the other side of the sine wave. At the very bottom, another vulnerability or threat is manifests itself, and then the process starts again. And it's this ongoing cycle that is really sort of defines the tempo of cybersecurity for at least the past 30 years. That window of exposure always favors the bad guys because there's no way the good guys will know everything that's going on all the time. At UMBC, we have several researchers that work on applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to develop better situational awareness to give the good guys some help in figuring out what's wrong and what might be coming. But it's not a guaranteed solution. On matters of cybersecurity, on terrorism, on pretty much any sort of nefarious activity, the bad guys will always be at least one step ahead of the good guys. That's just the way the world is these days. So how do we deal with this stuff? Well, as I've hinted at all along, we have to look at cybersecurity concerns holistically, from an interdisciplinary approach, and certainly collaboratively, meaning together, okay? You might even think of it as a systems-based approach to looking at relationships, thinking like an adversary, and conducting risk analysis. It's not just looking at the bits and bytes and the network diagrams on the whiteboard. We have to look at the business processes that are involved with these systems, the people that are involved, who's designing and developing these systems, who's deploying these systems, who's using these systems down the road, and of course, who's attacking them and who's defending them. So we have to look at cybersecurity, the risk of cybersecurity and cyber threats broadly and holistically. And that goes far beyond just the bits and the bytes. Related to that is we have to learn, and this is coming, I think, as a function of society. We need to teach our youth more about media and technology literacy early on. So, when you give your child that first iPad or that first cell phone or that first laptop, do they know? They're probably teaching the parents how to set it up, but are they looking at the various security features to ensure their privacy? And when they go on to social media, that they know how to lock down the account for privacy purposes? Do they know who's watching their social media accounts? What the companies, the Metas, the Twitters, the Twitches, what are they doing? Okay, probably not. Okay, and that's where it falls upon us as educators to help provide public outreach, to raise awareness with parents and certainly the next generation, so that they, as they grow up, they're not just becoming users of the technology, but they're being informed and educated users. And they actually will start, hopefully, learn how to take some control back of how much of the security of their devices. For example, whenever I buy a new phone, the first thing I do is turn off all the messages, all the alerts, all the red dots, all the sound alerts, all the chirps, all the banners. I will use my phone the way I want to use it, not the way Apple wants me to use it. Okay. We need to remember and foster this idea that just because technology is provided to us in a certain way doesn't mean that's the only way we can do it or use it. Okay. And that comes down to technology literacy. This means that educating the next generation is not just a STEM thing. We have to look more broadly. Okay. Embrace the non-STEM fields as well. The humanities are just as important to understanding the why things break, and why we can't fix certain problems. Not a technical problem. Yes, it's a technical issue we're dealing with, but the solution may not be technical. It may be related to people, okay? But we can't focus exclusively on the bits and the bytes. Unfortunately, what we see all too often, and we still see it even these days, when things go burr, what's the response? A lot of hand waving, hand wringing, more white papers, task forces are created to develop recommendations, and executive councils to discuss best practices for preventing the next problem, preventing the next solar wind, preventing the next Baltimore ransomware attack. Well, I hate to say it, folks, but all of these things just repeat history. We know what to do. We in the cybersecurity and the IT world have written the recommendations already. It's basic cybersecurity and IT 101, okay? If we're not doing basic best practices, we're just making it very easy for the bad guys to cause mischief. And again, not to harp on Baltimore, but a lot of the Baltimore ransomware event, a lot of the costs and the delays in getting back online was because they failed to do basic IT 101. Things like having good backups, having network-based support that they could remotely troubleshoot systems. No, they had to have somebody go physically around the city to various government offices to reset computers, okay? That's not helpful in 2022 or 2019. So we know what to do. We're just not doing it. And that's not a function of technology, that's a function of people. And that comes back to what I said about, perhaps the biggest threat we face is that a lot of these problems are self-inflicted because we're doing it to ourselves. By omission or by acts of commission, we're creating the environment that allows cybersecurity mischief, if you will, to take place. So the bottom line here is that, in terms of cybersecurity and, whatever threats you might hear about in the news or even from me tonight or in courses, if you think technology alone can solve the problem, you don't understand the problem, and you probably don't understand people either, okay? Cybersecurity is truly an interdisciplinary concern, and that requires an interdisciplinary response. I hope that made sense. I'm extremely jacked up on coffee this evening, so I know I blew through a lot of stuff, and I'm happy to take a step back, take some water, and answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, go ahead and send them directly to myself or Dr. Forno. I was having some issues with the chat. I had some questions while people are trying to gather their thoughts. Actually, I am going to change it so people can post it. Hold on. So if you have a question, just type it in the chat room. So you hit a lot of different things, Dr. Forno, and one of the questions that I had was, is cybersecurity, you said it's kind of like these things are a risk because of omissions or commissions. I guess my question is this one of those things where we're not really going to make any changes or learn until there's a major catastrophic event, like what COVID did, the way they were looking at the medical stuff, or 9/11 did to terrorism and things like that?
I would say no, that will not happen. I'll give you two examples, one that's cyber related and one that's not. The non-cyber related, if nothing happened after an attack on an elementary school in Connecticut killed several students and teachers, and it was a massacre, and this country did not do anything about the gun violence problem, okay, that should have been a root of an awakening. It didn't. Nothing major happened. On cybersecurity, think back to the breach of the credit records from Equifax or Experian a couple of years ago. Everybody in this country has a credit record that is owned by one of these bureaus. Okay, so you're talking 200 million records plus. Okay, you would think that knowing that you, me, people on this call, Congress folks, senators, business CEOs would have banded together and said, wow, this is a problem. How did this breach occur that compromised all of this personal information? Nothing major came of that either. Within the government, I'll give you a third example. There was a huge data breach at the Office of Personnel Management several years ago, where government employee and security clearance information, going back a long time, was compromised. If that didn't spur the federal government into action on national security grounds, what will? So that's a long-winded answer of saying, no, I remain cynical because it's, for whatever reason, we collectively have decided that this is just the price of doing business online, and we'll just deal with it and, and move on. But along the way, we'll start creating new task forces that write new white papers with new recommendations. And I've always said one of my April Fool's pranks one of these years is going to be to take an old report from 2000 or 1997, change the date, change the font, and then kind of leak it out there on Reddit and see if anybody notices that, gee, this brand new shiny report from 2022 is exactly the same thing that was proposed in 1997. And I'll bet nobody would notice. And that's a huge concern.
So there was a question, is there any resources to read, case studies related to cybersecurity incidents that you would suggest?
Where to begin? The short answer would be, Google is your friend. You could look at, certainly any number of current news headlines is available. You have in terms of data breaches, a very popular report that's almost like an industry standard report every year is the Verizon data breach report that comes out every year from Verizon. That's full of useful information and metrics and statistics. A lot of companies will produce their own reports on various types of cybersecurity incidents. Historically, you can look at the Carnegie Mellon Computer Emergency Response Team, the Carnegie Mellon CERT, C-E-R-T. U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. CERT has historical data as well. And then, of course, there are any number of books that are out there that do a deep dive into cybersecurity incidents. Shameless plug. The book that we that came out back in August or in April, we talk about the Baltimore and Atlanta ransomware attacks in some detail as well. So there's a wide range of resources that are out there, many of which are free.
I actually have some additional questions as people are. You seem like, I don't know, mine are kind of going to go across the spectrum. So this is going to be kind of random.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of curious. What is your thoughts on like cyber security insurance? And where I'm going with the question is, you said that's the cost of doing business. Are we just getting into a place where it's just like it's an acceptable loss, like sort of like how shoplifting has become an acceptable loss for certain companies? But like, are we just at that point? Because in my industry, we are getting more and more requirements to have cybersecurity insurance up to millions and millions of dollars of coverage. And when I would talk to my insurance broker, they would just say that the cost of handling these incidents just continues to rise. Is this going to stop, or is this just going to continue to go?
That's actually a really great question. I'm glad you raised it. Cybersecurity insurance has been around for the past, 10 years, 15 years. And the idea is like the way you take out an insurance policy on your car, your house, or your boat, you do the same thing to cover you in the event of a cyber attack, to cover any losses or damages or staff overtime to rebuild and recover. What we're seeing now are insurance companies offering cyber insurance, creating very specific riders and very specific policies that basically say, if this incident is because you screwed up, that you didn't do best practices, if you're not in compliance with a certain standard, or if we determine that this is a preventable attack, we aren't going to cover you. And I think that's useful for the insurance companies, but also for the business, because for years, I've always believed that cyber insurance is a great way, as all insurance is, of transferring risk from one company's books to another company's books. And that's helpful from an accounting perspective, but from a cybersecurity perspective and an IT perspective, if I'm running a large network or a large company and we get attacked, well, all I need to do is just file a claim and it doesn't cost us anything. We can carry on business as usual. There's no accountability for my short-sightedness, my failings with that of my team. So I think companies now have realized we can't just issue blanket policies covering incidents. We've got to really lock it down into a way to make it more manageable for the insurers and how they underwrite policies, and not just cover anything that might happen. Because a lot of companies, I think, were using cyber insurance as a way of, covering up for complacency. And that to me is not a recipe for good security.
So I'm going to continue to ask my questions if no one else is. So back to the Baltimore thing, I remember when that story happened, and I guess my question to this is, who ultimately, how do you think that should be addressed? Is that something where that's a state thing that they should be helping, or is it a federal thing, or is that local, or is that a collection?
For what? For the insurance?
No, for the protection and ensuring the cybersecurity of local government, right? Is that top down or is that bottom up? And I was just wondering, as you answered that, I know like the CISA, the DHS, CISA agency, they do a lot of local outreach where they work with local governments to try to get them federal resources. Are you a proponent of that?
Yeah, and unfortunately, politics, whether it's just normal politics or, I hate to say it, partisan politics, gets in the way a lot of times. And really, I wish cybersecurity could transcend partisan politics, and because this affects everybody, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or independent or a socialist. Okay, we all live in the same general community. States and local governments, I mean, there are, states and cities and counties talk all the time. They exchange, information. Maryland's a great example. Maryland has a chief security officer in Annapolis. He works regularly with the counties and the cities. They stay in touch. They're Maryland councils. They share best practices and threat information and help each other out. And that's, state working with the local governments, and then the local governments reaching out to the state as needed. So that works both ways. When the federal government gets involved through CISA and DHS, then you run into some more political issues, because some states have pushed back saying, well, if you come in to help us, you're violating states' rights. Article 10 of the Constitution, cybersecurity is a power reserved for the states. And we saw that pushback occur going into the 2016 and 2020 elections, where CISA was offering assistance to states to provide monitoring and network security of their various election-related infrastructures, and a lot of states, steering to one side of the political spectrum, said, "No, how dare you? You're encroaching in our territory." So that politics makes it a much more complicated situation, unfortunately. I am proud to say that within Maryland, again, tooting UMBC's horn for a minute, we've been actively involved with Annapolis and work with state organizations to help support their IT security needs. We last year launched the Maryland Institute for Innovative Computing, part of which is to leverage qualified computer science and cybersecurity and students with a security background or an IT background as a surge capability to support state entities in the event of a major cyber crisis, or local governments for that matter. We have intern programs that will place interns with state entities as well. So again, there's a wealth of resources within the states that can be leveraged to help narrow the workforce gap with state and local government IT and cybersecurity needs.
So I don't see any other questions, but I wanted to end with a kind of a lighter question. You mentioned the metaverse, and then recently in the news I saw where Texas is banning TikTok on state devices. Can you elaborate any more on your thoughts on these kind of things? Like, I mean, is that a risk, TikTok and metaverse and the next Chinese app that we get, things like that?
How much time do you have? All of these, and I mentioned briefly the idea of BYOD, bring your own device to work. I think this also is related to the idea of downloading various tools to various devices and programs. Yeah, if your software is made in China and the data center is in China and it's sending data into that data center in China, I've got a problem with that. Okay, from a security perspective, from a privacy perspective. Zoom, the platform we're on right now, had this problem exposed early in the pandemic when people realized, wait a minute, a lot of the users, their data was going to Zoom data centers in China, and then Zoom had to quickly roll out a U.S. government, a federal version that had all of the Zoom chats hosted in this country, in data centers in the U.S. Yeah, absolutely. These type of things, you don't know what's in the software, which goes into the idea of supply chain security. One idea that's been floated for years has been almost like a software underwriter's lab that would look at source code of programs and operating systems to look for backdoors and things like that. For many years, NSA did this on the unclassified side when they would accredit certain operating systems to a certain degree of security. They stopped doing that about 15, 20 years ago. But that was one example of trying to understand what we're bringing into our environments and whether or not we could trust it. But yeah, to your point, I certainly would not trust any application that suddenly becomes popular, like TikTok or Twitch.
So, do you think we're actually more we're more secure or less secure? Like, just last question, do you think we're more secure or less secure?
I think we will probably always, or at least for the foreseeable future, be leaning towards less secure. Again, people are attracted to the shiny and the cool. Think back to the early aughts when social media first took off, MySpace, LiveJournal, some of these old platforms. People often, kids, teenagers, college kids, they ran to these platforms and they were pouring out their lives online without giving a thought as to who else might be reading these things. Okay. Then they go apply for a job 10 years later, and a MySpace post shows up in an investigation. That's embarrassing. Okay. So yeah, humans are attracted to the shiny, and we will rush to embrace a platform, a product, or a technology very quickly before thinking what are the consequences. Gmail is another example. Everybody was given 2 gigs of free storage space on Gmail. Took off. Everybody went to Gmail. No one thought, well, what about paying for it? This is great. Well, yeah, because they're the product. Google is mining their inboxes to develop targeted marketing. So we have to think about these trade-offs, and I think human nature will always lead us towards the more insecure side, because again, it's shiny, it's cool, and off we go. I saw a few questions pop up here in the chat. I'm gonna figure we'll hit those before we leave, if that's all right.
Yeah, I saw there was one about the clearance, and I reached out to her directly. I don't think you need to address that one. But there was a question about specific courses and certifications that you would recommend.
Specific courses, well, again, it depends on your background. If you're in IT or technology already, you could certainly, jump right into a cybersecurity, whether it's a degree program or a training or certification program. Again, to toot UMBC's horn, I run a graduate program. That's great. We'd love to talk. UMBC also has a non-credit organization in Columbia called UMBC Training Centers. So if you're looking for like a boot camp type of experience to, career change from being a satellite operator in the military to becoming a junior cybersecurity person, you could go through their boot camp process and learn all the skills you need to become a technician and be functional upon completion of that program. So it really depends on what your goals are. And then I'll also say a third option is to just look on your own. There are a ton of YouTube videos out there that some are very good. Network, go to hacker conferences. Like B-Sides is a great one. Baltimore has one called B-Sides Charm. ShmooCon is another big cybersecurity conference every January in DC. If you can get a ticket for it, good luck. It's one of the hottest tickets in town behind the White House press gala. So really just depends on where your interests lie in cybersecurity, and what your background is would, sort of dictate what path you would follow. Okay, let's see. Other questions? Yeah, okay, that was just a comment. The hot ticket is a conference called ShmooCon, SchMoocon. It's held in usually late January every year. Been there a couple of times. Tickets usually sell out. I'm going to be optimistic and say within minutes. Um, it's a hot ticket to get. It's run by some folks who actually live in Catonsville, near UMBC, who I know. It's a great conference. I've been there a couple of times to speak. It's sort of like the DEF CON of the East in some ways. There's some really good, deep technical talks, some good networking, and a lot of socialization. It's fun if you can get in. All right,
Actually,
uh,
the tickets sold out in 8 seconds. Actually,
okay, well, that was
yeah, which is insane. That's insane. But yeah, I've never been there, but I knew that they were popular, and they keep the statistics on the website how quickly they sell out.
I went early years ago, and then I couldn't. I didn't want to play the game and develop a script to check the website and this and that. So finally, when the organizer emailed me about 7 or 8 years ago, said, "Hey, we're putting a panel together. Do you want to be on the panel?" I just jumped. I don't care what the panel is. Get me in there. And the panel was actually wonderful, but it's just it's a great event to be at. Okay, let's see. Last question. I heard that government monitors all the data on the internet and there's no privacy. Do you know why? Does people need to be concerned about that? The government has been monitoring the internet long before a lot of people even knew what the internet was. You can look, most recently, I think people became aware of it through the Snowden disclosures back in 2013, when they saw the pervasiveness of how deeply the government and law enforcement were monitoring internet capabilities. Yes, the government monitors the internet. Does it scare me or frighten me or concern me? No. If I was sitting in Moscow or Beijing or Tehran or Venezuela, yeah, I'd be concerned. But no, if the US government is monitoring the internet, I'm not as concerned. I am more concerned, to be honest, with private companies monitoring the internet and monitoring web traffic and activity and social media accounts and my networks and social connections, and then using that data to profile me to then target ads or target whatever at me. That to me is a bigger concern than what the US government is doing. I know that's not a very popular opinion. Most folks think the government's all bad, but to be honest, I'm much more concerned with what commercial companies are doing in terms of internet surveillance, whether it's for copyright enforcement or pirated material, or just profiling people to sell them more stuff, if you will. Big reason why I've never been on Facebook. I have no desire to be on Facebook.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting watching the dynamics in play between companies, though, because with Apple rolling out some of the privacy things that kind of limit some of the tracking that Facebook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing just rolled out this week is going to be very, very interesting. I think it's long overdue. They started on this path a couple of years ago when they started blocking Facebook's tracking stuff, and Mark Zuckerberg blew a gasket because they lost, I think, 10 billion or something like that in advertising from Apple folks. But what they announced this week about extending their end-to-end encryption capabilities within the iOS and the iCloud environment, making it much more secure, where even Apple cannot decrypt your backups. That to me is a very good thing. Law enforcement and intelligence will certainly complain and say that's making our lives more difficult. I get that. I respect that. It's a trade-off. But things like this, I would be more inclined to support, the greater security versus either having backdoors that weaken everything for everybody just to protect, in the name of law enforcement. But that's a discussion we can have on another date. I don't want to go into that here, but I think Apple's doing the right thing with their privacy and security announcements, particularly what they announced yesterday.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to end, Dr. Forno. That was very interesting. I think that if anyone wants to reach out to you, did you want to share any of your contact information?
Yeah, I'm doing that.
Because I know that a quick Google search, you can find Dr. Forno pretty easily. He has a lot of information on the UMBC site, and he has his personal site that includes references to a lot of the material and the book that he wrote. I did put a link to the Wiley book in there. I would definitely recommend reaching out. But again, thank you everyone that joined us. Thank you, Dr. Forno. I really appreciate it. And hopefully, yeah, thank you. And I look forward to seeing everyone at the next event. Have a good night, everyone.